Russian forces are storming the positions of the Ukrainians along the E50 highway on the western parts of Pokrovsk, the town of Rodinsk on the northern flank along the northern highway, and directly to the east of Myrnohrad, as Russians are looking to cut off the supply lines leading into the city, operationally encircling Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, while storming Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk directly from the south and from the east to keep the Ukrainian forces within the pocket. The Russian pressure on the flanks are centered around the fortifications on the western outskirts of the city, with full control over the 0406 highway, as well as the first lines along the railway area. The Russians have secured an additional highway that leads into the city from the western direction, in addition to the southern supply routes. In the northern parts, the Russians have also reached the outskirts of the industrial area, and in some part are contesting an entry into the industrial area to gain a foothold within it. Gaining control over the industrial area will allow the Russians to physically cut off the E50 highway, which will enable the Russians to start pressuring the northern roads leading into Pokrovsk from the northern flank, in between the northern and western highways. The Russians are also kicking the Ukrainian forces out of the residential area on the western outskirts of the city, as they are consolidating their positions within it. The Russian pressure continues not just on the western outskirts, but also on the eastern outskirts, as Russians are now storming the towns of Kosatske, Promin, and Balahan, all three of them at the same time, with a general assault on the eastern flank. The Russians have regained full control over the fortifications in the vicinity of Novoekonomishne, as fighting continues over the remaining parts of the industrial area, where they are clearing out what remains of Ukrainian forces. And with the fighting reaching the outskirts of Myrnohrad, it is only a matter of time before the Russians start storming it directly as well, similar to what we saw at Avdiivka towards the end of the siege of that city. The Russian siege of Rodinsk also continues, as the Russians have managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Lyman and are now storming Rodinsk from not just the eastern direction but also the southern direction, gaining an additional foothold within the city and pushing the Ukrainians out of the eastern outskirts. With this, the Russians have a much safer road leading into the city, which will strengthen their offensive capabilities to gain full control over the apartment complex area and cut off the northern highway in its entirety. This will allow the Russians to cut off the northern and western highways, which will leave the Ukrainians with some off-roads to resupply Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, which will be constantly under fire by Russian forces, both directly and indirectly, with the use of drones, artillery, and FAB bombs. With these developments and the current operations by the Russians, we are now entering the end game of the fighting over Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, where the Russians are cutting off the final supply routes, which will force either a Ukrainian withdrawal from the cities of Myrnohrad and Pokrovsk, or an encirclement of the Ukrainian grouping of forces operating within these cities, which will significantly weaken their positions and allow for a quicker Russian capture of them. This means that the battles over these cities will likely be ending before the end of the year. The Ukrainians can speed up the loss of these cities by withdrawing, or delay it by counterattacking the flanks and the cities themselves. That is why it is impossible to estimate when these cities will be captured. Instead, the clear trend is that the Russians are cutting off the final supply routes in and out of these cities, which significantly complicates the Ukrainian operations within them. To the southwest of this, the Russians have managed to make two advances within the borders and within the Dnipropetrovsk region itself. The Russians have captured the southern first lines south of the Hourglass Formation west of Moravka, gaining control over which will allow the Russians to secure the border section and redirect their forces towards Novomykolaiivka, where the Ukrainians are looking to cut off the supplies to the Russian forces operating within Moravka. With the capture of the southern roads, the Russians now have additional supply routes leading into Moravka, easing the effects of the Ukrainian recapture of Novomykolaiivka. As for the Filia direction, the Russians have expanded the zone of control along the Vovcha river line, where they're looking to secure additional crossings over to consolidate their positions in the vicinity of Filia, the northern flank, and in the eastern flank of Ivanivka, as they continue their pressure on Novopavlivka from the eastern, southern, and western directions. Along the Donetsk Canal, the Russians have managed to gain control over a wider portion of it on the eastern flank of Markova and Novomarkova. The Russians continued offensive operations along the canal to secure the canal itself for additional offensive operations on the northern flank of Chesev Yar towards Maiske, Markova, and Novomarkova to secure the northern flank of Chesev Yar to continued offensive operations on Kostiantynivka, where the objective is to gain control over the entirety of the high ground overlooking the Sloviansk-Kostiantynivka line and to cut off the roads leading into Kostiantynivka from the northwestern direction. The Russians also managed to make some deeper infiltrations on the northern flank of Siversk. According to Deep State Map, the Russian objective here is not to consolidate their positions, as they have yet to make any consolidated positions within Serbyanka. They are simply occupying some positions and then continuing onwards as soon as they have gathered their forces for their next positions along the area. And this makes a lot of sense, as we have seen with Serbyanka. The town itself is completely destroyed. There are a few basements where the Russians can establish some positions. However, it will never be able to face off against the fortifications on the northern flank of Siversk. Instead, what the Russians are doing is that they are attempting to gain as much territory as possible before the Ukrainians reorganize themselves in the area. They have managed to reach into the settlement of Dronivka, which allows them to put some pressure on a Ukrainian settlement that is much more preferable to consolidate positions within than Serbyanka, and it is also overlooking the supply route leading into Siversk from the western direction connected to Lyman. Therefore, the Russians are doubling down on their offensive operations to gain control over Dronivka and the fortifications on the northern flank of Siversk, cutting off the western highway and bypassing the fortifications of Siversk itself by flanking them completely, while the Russians are also continuing their offensive operations on the southern flank of the town, where they are consolidating their positions in the settlements captured there. As for the Lyman section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain control over additional parts of the defensive line, gaining full control over the area to the north of Stavki all the way to Drobrisheve on the northern flank of these settlements. The Russians are here working on consolidating their positions north of both settlements before storming them. Gaining control over Stavki will allow the Russians to connect their forces between Sarishne in the east with Stavki in the north, and then onwards towards Dobrisheve, where it will also connect their forces from the east and the north, but it will also cut off the supply lines of the Ukrainians leading through the town and into Lyman in the south. Therefore, the Russian objective here is consolidate their positions along the defensive line, which is consisting of anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, before creating some passages through to storm these settlements, gain control over which significantly improves the logistics of the Russian forces and complicates the logistics of the Ukrainians. The Russians are now getting closer and closer to the siege of Lyman, while the sieges of Siversk and Kostiantynivka, as well as Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, are continuing. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians have advanced, as well as the Ukrainians within Kupyansk, where the Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Borisivka and Rivka following the capture of the fortifications at the end of last month. This allowed the Russians to enter into the settlement and outflank the fortifications of the Ukrainians facing the eastern direction in the vicinity of Stepi, Kopenki, and Seleny High. If the Russians are able to gain full control over the settlement, they'll be able to flank the fortifications similar to what we're seeing in the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region, in which the Russians can gain control over these fortifications that overlook the road connecting the settlements from the northern flank to the southern flank in the vicinity of Novy Mir, Novomikhailivka, Ridkodub, and Nove in the south, with the settlements of Kupanki, Stepi, and Vishneve in the north. Gaining control over these fortifications is going to weaken the Ukrainian defensive capabilities east and north of Borova, and also flank the fortifications in the southern flank, which will dismantle the second line of defense outside of Borova and push the Ukrainians back to the first line of defense, creating a much smaller pocket operating east of the Uskal River line. As for Kupyansk itself, the Russians started storming the operationally encircled Ukrainian forces, which forced a withdrawal of the Ukrainian forces from the town itself. Now that the Ukrainians are throwing, the Russians are constantly attacking these Ukrainian positions, clearing whoever hasn't made it out and attacking the ones who are escaping. This is causing a lot of casualties among the Ukrainians, as we have seen in the direction of Volodar and other operational encirclements throughout this war, this is a repeat of another such scenario, one that will likely be repeated in Pokrovsk if the Ukrainians cannot consolidate or reorganize their positions in the area and counterattack the Russian forces operating on the flanks. With this, the Russians will quickly gain control over the northern and central parts of Kupyansk, kicking the Ukrainians out to the outskirts in the southern parts, to which the Ukrainians will have a difficult time holding the final positions along the outskirts. This allowed the Russians to consolidate a significant amount of forces within Kupyansk and to start the operations to gain full control over the Kupyansk area on the eastern bank of the Uskar River line, to cut off the remaining crossings, gain physical control over the western bank of the Uskar River line to physically encircle what remains of Ukrainian forces on the eastern bank of the Uskar River line before capturing the entire area, which will lead to the Russians closing a large section of the front line, which has limited the Russian offensive capabilities along those river lines. With the capture of the area, the Russians will be able to start pushing in the direction of Borova with a much stronger force, as Satova would be limited to supplying this much smaller section of the front line, and with operations taking place in the vicinity of Borova, the situation will drastically change in favor of the Russians, and additional forces can also be used in the vicinity of Lyman from the northwestern, northern, and eastern directions. The fall of Kupyansk from Ukrainian to Russian hands would therefore have a domino effect in favor of the Russians, significantly switching the balance of power here along the eastern bank of the Uskar River line in favor of the Russians. As for the northern flank of Kupyansk, the Ukrainians are attempting to recapture the supply lines leading into Kupyansk and encircle the Russian forces operating within the town by counterattacking to the south of Tishynivkivka, where this geolocated footage confirms Ukrainian positions along the road, cutting off the road leading into Moskovka, while the Ukrainians continue to operate within the town here on the northwestern outskirts of Kupyansk. The Ukrainian objective is to cut off all of the Russian supply lines leading into Kupyansk and reverse the advances the Russians have made within the city. However, as the situation stands, it is almost too late for the Ukrainians to gain any success with that, and the Russians will be able to counterattack with a much greater force than what is currently defending in the area. And with the Russians gaining full control over Kupyansk, it will become a new logistical hub for the Russian forces. And if they're able to gain control over the Eastern Highway as well, the supply lines will be significantly shortened, and the number of supplies going to Kupyansk will significantly increase in favor of the Russians, from where they can concentrate a much larger force. Finally, in the northern section of the front line in the Sumi region, the Russians managed to regain control over Varoshina. This allowed them to secure the eastern flank of Novomykolaivka as the Ukrainians restarted offensive operations towards Oleksivka in the southwest. And that is going to be all for this update. It has been your host, Weep Union. Thank you for watching and have a great day.